The silence of the dusty Main Street in La Junta, Colorado, was shattered by the sound of breaking glass and angry voices. It was 1878, and the small frontier town was experiencing another day of conflict that would forever change the lives of two people who had yet to meet. Zachary Williston stood frozen on the boardwalk, her hands gripping her journal tightly to her chest, as her father's rage echoed through the town. "I told you never to speak in public." Theodore Williston's face was crimson with fury as he towered over his 20-year-old daughter. "A lady's place is to be seen and not heard." Zachary's eyes filled with tears, but she kept her chin high despite the humiliation of being dressed down in front of the entire town. Her crime had been answering a simple question from Mrs. Abernathy about her father's store inventory. 3 sentences that had cost her dearly. "You embarrass this family with your outspokenness," her father continued, his voice lowering to a hiss. "Your mother would be ashamed." The mention of her mother, gone 5 years now, was the cruelest cut. Zachary's shoulders slumped as she nodded, knowing that any verbal response would only worsen her situation. "Go home," Theodore ordered, glancing nervously at the gathering onlookers. "We'll discuss your punishment there." As Zachary turned to leave, she noticed a tall stranger watching from across the street. He leaned against a post outside the saloon, his dark eyes following her with an intensity that made her pause. His dusty clothes and the well-worn holster at his hip marked him as one of the many cowboys passing through town. But unlike most men who quickly averted their gaze when caught staring, this one maintained eye contact, his expression not of judgment but of curiosity. He tipped his hat slightly in acknowledgement before turning to enter the saloon. Zachary hurried home, her father's footsteps heavy behind her. The cowboy was forgotten as she prepared herself for the lecture to come. Miles Dawson had seen many things in his 30 years, but the public humiliation of the dark-haired woman on the main street had stirred something in him. He ordered a whiskey and found a quiet corner in the saloon, trying to make sense of his reaction. New in town. The barkeep was an older man with a friendly demeanor. "Just passing through," Miles replied, sipping his drink. "Heading to my brother's ranch outside of town. Figured I'd rest up here for a night." "Well, welcome to La Junta," the man said, wiping down the counter. "I'm Samuel Green." "Miles Dawson," he replied. After a moment's hesitation, he added, "That man on the street, the one shouting at the young woman. Who is he?" Samuel's expression darkened. "Theodore Williston. Owns the general store. Been here for 10 years or so. That was his daughter, Zachary." Zachary. Unusual name for a woman. Her mother's family name. She's a good girl, smart as a whip. Too smart for her own good, if you ask Williston. Samuel leaned closer. "He's got strange ideas about women should be silent in public. Keeps her locked up in that store most days." Miles frowned. "Seems extreme." "Williston lost his wife 5 years back. Got even stricter with the girl after that. Shame, really. Zachary has a mind for business and numbers that'd put most men to shame, but her father won't hear of it." Samuel shook his head. "Most folks around here just accept it as Williston's way." The conversation shifted to other topics, but Miles found himself unable to forget the defeated look in Zachary Williston's eyes. Zachary sat quietly at the dinner table that evening, her father's lecture still ringing in her ears. Her punishment was what she had expected: confinement to the house, except for church and work at the store for the next month. No visits to friends, no trips to the lending library that was her one solace in La Junta. "It's for your own good, Zachary," Theodore said, his voice calmer now. "A woman who speaks out of turn will never find a suitable husband. I'm only trying to protect you." She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Her father wasn't a cruel man, just rigid in his beliefs. Since her mother's death, He had become obsessed with the idea that Zachary needed to be the perfect, quiet lady to secure her future. "I've invited Reverend Phillips for dinner tomorrow," he continued. "His nephew is visiting from Denver, a lawyer with good prospects. Another suitor." Zachary suppressed a sigh. Her father had been parading eligible men before her for the past year, all of whom expected a demure, silent wife who would manage their household without opinions of her own. "May I be excused?" she finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Theodore nodded, pleased by her subdued manner. "You may. Remember, the store opens early tomorrow." In the privacy of her room, Zachary pulled out her journal from its hiding place beneath a loose floorboard. Here, in these pages, she could speak freely. Her thoughts, dreams, and observations filled dozens of journals hidden throughout the house. Writing was her voice when speaking was forbidden. Tonight, she found herself describing the stranger who had watched her with such interest. There had been something different in his gaze, not pity or judgment, but recognition. As if he had seen her, truly seen her, in a way no one in La Junta ever had. Morning came too quickly. Zachary pinned her hair into a severe bun and donned her plainest dress, hoping to attract as little attention as possible. The store would be busy with the Saturday crowd, and she needed to focus on her work rather than dwelling on yesterday's humiliation. Theodore opened the store at 7 o'clock sharp, and customers began to trickle in. Zachary took her place behind the counter, tallying purchases and wrapping parcels without speaking unless directly addressed by her father. The bell above the door jingled at mid-morning, and Zachary looked up to see the stranger from yesterday enter the store. Up close, he was even more imposing, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. His face was tanned from the sun, with lines around his eyes suggesting he smiled often. "Good morning," Theodore greeted him. "What can I help you with today?" "Just picking up some supplies," the man answered, his voice deep and resonant. "Heading out to the Davidson Ranch tomorrow." "Robert Davidson's place?" Theodore's demeanor changed instantly. The Davidsons were one of the wealthiest families in the area. "You must be the brother he's been expecting." "Miles Dawson," the man confirmed, offering his hand. "Theodore Williston, pleased to meet you." Theodore shook his hand enthusiastically. "This is my daughter, Zachary." Miles turned to her, and Zachary felt her cheeks warm under his direct gaze. She nodded politely, keeping her eyes downcast as was expected. "Miss Williston," he acknowledged, the ghost of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "A pleasure. Do you have a list of what you need?" Theodore asked, drawing Miles's attention back. "Right here." Miles produced a folded paper from his pocket. "My brother's wife was quite specific." Theodore took the list and began gathering items. "Zachary, help Mr. Dawson find what he needs while I check the storeroom for the coffee." Zachary's eyes widened slightly at being left alone with a customer, something her father rarely allowed. Theodore disappeared into the back room, leaving her standing awkwardly before the cowboy. Miles Dawson stepped closer to the counter. "I'm sorry about yesterday," he said quietly. Surprised, Zachary glanced up to meet his gaze. "I couldn't help but overhear," he continued. "Seems unfair. A bright young woman not being allowed to speak her mind." Zachary glanced nervously toward the storeroom door. "I should gather your items," she whispered, reaching for the list he had placed on the counter. Their fingers brushed as she took the paper, and she pulled back as if burned. Miles watched her with that same curious intensity from yesterday. "You know," he said conversationally as she began selecting items from the shelves, "my sister-in-law Elizabeth runs most of the business side of the ranch. Has a head for figures that puts my brother and me to shame." Zachary paused, a tin of tobacco in her hand. She's even published articles in agricultural journals under a pen name, Miles continued, following her around the store. Robert couldn't be prouder, though he pretends to be scandalized when anyone mentions it. A small smile tugged at Zachary's lips, though she quickly suppressed it. "I imagine you have plenty of thoughts worth hearing, Miss Williston," Miles said softly. "If you were permitted to share them." The storeroom door creaked, and Zachary hurriedly resumed her task, placing items on the counter with trembling hands. Her father returned with a large bag of coffee beans. "Found it," Theodore announced. "Last one in stock." "Much obliged," Miles said, his manner changing to match Theodore's businesslike tone. "How much do I owe you?" As her father calculated the bill, Zachary finished gathering the remaining items on the list. When she placed the last package on the counter, Miles looked directly at her. "Is there anything you'd recommend adding, Miss Williston? Something my sister-in-law might have forgotten?" Theodore frowned slightly, but the connection to the Davidson family made him hesitate before intervening. Zachary's eyes darted between the two men, caught off guard by the direct question. Perhaps some peppermint oil," she suggested quietly. "It's useful for headaches and stomach ailments. Good to have on a ranch far from town." Miles nodded thoughtfully. "Excellent suggestion. I'll take that as well." Theodore's frown deepened, but he added the item to the total. "That'll be $4.75. Miles paid and gathered his purchases. "Thank you for the advice, Miss Williston," he said, his eyes meeting hers again. "I hope to see you again before I leave town." After he departed, Theodore turned to Zachary with narrowed eyes. "That was forward of you, offering suggestions without being asked directly." "He did ask me directly, Father," Zachary pointed out, immediately regretting her defensive tone. "Mind your place, Zachary," Theodore warned. "Even with the Davidson connection, that man is still a drifter, a cowboy. Not the sort of man a lady engages in conversation." Zachary nodded obediently, but for the rest of the day, she found herself replaying those few minutes of almost normal conversation with Miles Dawson. It was the first time in years that someone had actually seemed interested in her thoughts. Sunday morning brought church services, and Zachary sat silently beside her father in their usual pew. She was surprised to see Miles Dawson enter the church just before the service began. He nodded politely to those who noticed him and took a seat near the back. Throughout Reverend Philip's sermon on obedience and the virtuous woman, Zachary was acutely aware of Miles's presence. Once, when she risked a glance back, she found him watching her, that same thoughtful expression on his face. After the service, Theodore guided her toward Reverend Philip's and a young man in an expensive suit, the nephew from Denver, she assumed. As they approached, Zachary felt a presence at her side and turned to find Miles Dawson. "Mr. Williston, Miss Williston," he greeted them. "Fine sermon today." Theodore nodded stiffly. "Mr. Dawson, I didn't expect to see you in church this morning." "My mother raised us to never miss Sunday service," Miles replied with an easy smile, "even on the trail." "Admirable," Theodore said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "If you'll excuse us, we're meeting with Reverend Phillips." "Of course." Miles tipped his hat. "Miss Williston, I wanted to let you know the peppermint oil was much appreciated. Elizabeth was delighted with the suggestion." Zachary smiled slightly, keeping her eyes lowered. "I'm glad it was helpful." "You visited the ranch already?" Theodore asked, surprised. "Rode out yesterday afternoon," Miles confirmed. "Just came back for church and a few more supplies before heading back. My brother's expecting a shipment of cattle tomorrow that needs tending." Before Theodore could respond, Reverend Phillips approached with his nephew in tow. "Theodore, so good to see you and Zachary. This is my nephew, Harold Fleming. The young lawyer bowed stiffly, his gaze barely touching Zachary before moving to Miles with obvious curiosity. Miles Dawson, Miles introduced himself. Just passing through on my way to the Davidson Ranch. Harold's demeanor changed instantly. The cattle operation, I've heard it's quite impressive. Growing every year, Miles agreed. Robert and Elizabeth have built something special out there. Mr. Dawson was just leaving, Theodore interjected. We'd be pleased if you join us for dinner, Mr. Fleming. Miles took the hint. Indeed, good day, everyone. His eyes lingered briefly on Zachary. Miss Williston. The dinner with Harold Fleming was excruciating. The young lawyer spoke at length about his practice in Denver and his plans for expansion, barely pausing to allow anyone else to speak. Not that it mattered. Theodore dominated what little conversation remained, while Zachary was expected to sit quietly and smile at appropriate intervals. Your daughter is very well-mannered, Harold commented to Theodore as Zachary served coffee after the meal. So many young women these days feel the need to express opinions on matters beyond their understanding. Zachary knows her place, Theodore replied proudly. Her mother and I raised her to be a proper lady. Zachary kept her expression neutral, though each word stung. In her father's eyes, her greatest accomplishment was her silence. Perhaps Miss Williston would enjoy a walk around town tomorrow, Harold suggested. I'll be staying through the week. Theodore beamed. An excellent idea. Zachary would be delighted. She nodded automatically, though the thought of spending more time with Harold Fleming filled her with dread. As the men returned to discussing business opportunities in Denver, Zachary retreated into her thoughts, remembering instead the brief conversation with Miles Dawson. The following day, Zachary was granted a reprieve from her walk with Harold when he was called to assist with some legal matter for his uncle. Instead, she worked in the store as usual, inventory day keeping her busy counting stock in the back room while her father managed the counter. The bell jingled mid-afternoon, and she heard her father greet a customer. Moments later, the storeroom door opened, and Theodore appeared. Zachary, Mr. Dawson needs some items from the list I've left on the counter. See to it while I finish the accounts. Surprised by this unexpected task, Zachary nodded and made her way to the front of the store. Miles stood by the counter, hat in hand, looking as if he'd ridden hard to reach town. Miss Williston, he greeted her, his voice warming. Mr. Dawson. She picked up the list her father had left. You've returned to town sooner than expected. He glanced toward the storeroom door. Actually, I volunteered to make the supply run. Wanted to see if the peppermint oil merchant had any other wise suggestions. Zachary couldn't help the small smile that curved her lips. What do you need today? Besides conversation with someone who thinks for herself, Miles asked quietly. When her eyes widened in alarm, he added more loudly, Just what's on the list, madam? As she gathered the items, he followed her around the store, maintaining a respectful distance but close enough to speak without being overheard. I met your father's preferred suitor after church, he commented. Zachary nearly dropped the tin of coffee she was reaching for. Mr. Fleming is not my suitor, she whispered. No, he seemed quite proprietary. Miles took the coffee from her hands, their fingers brushing again. And entirely unworthy of someone like you. You don't know anything about me, Mr. Dawson, she replied, moving to the next shelf. I know you're intelligent, I can see it in your eyes. His voice was serious now. I know you have thoughts and ideas that deserve to be heard. Zachary paused, a package of sugar in her hands. No one had ever spoken to her this way before. It was both terrifying and exhilarating. My father believes women should be seen and not heard, she said, so quietly he had to lean closer to catch her words. And what do you believe? Zachary Williston. Miles asked. The use of her full name, spoken with such genuine interest, broke something inside her. I believe, she whispered, that I am slowly disappearing. That one day I'll open my mouth to speak and find I've forgotten how. Miles's expression was solemn. I want to hear everything you think, he said. Every opinion, every idea, every dream you've been forced to keep silent. The storeroom door creaked, and they quickly moved apart. Zachary busied herself with the remaining items on the list while Miles examined a display of pocket watches. Almost finished, Mr. Dawson? Theodore asked, emerging from the back room with his ledger. Just about, Miles replied easily. Your daughter has been most helpful. Theodore nodded approvingly. Zachary knows our inventory better than anyone. That will be $2.30. As Miles paid, he addressed Theodore directly. Mr. Williston, my brother and sister-in-law are hosting a small gathering at the ranch this Saturday evening. Nothing formal, just a few neighbors and friends. They asked me to extend an invitation to you and Miss Williston. Theodore straightened, clearly flattered by the invitation from the prominent family. That's very kind. We would be honored to attend. Excellent, Miles said, gathering his purchases. Elizabeth will be pleased. She's eager to meet the young lady who recommended the peppermint oil. Apparently, it saved one of the ranch hands from a day of misery. Zachary kept her eyes lowered, but her heart was racing. A social gathering away from her father's watchful eye and a chance to meet a woman who published articles under a pen name. It seemed too good to be true. We'll look forward to it, Theodore said. Zachary, wrap Mr. Dawson's purchases properly. As she carefully packaged the items, Miles leaned slightly closer. Until Saturday, Miss Williston, he murmured. I look forward to continuing our conversation. After he left, Theodore seemed pleased with himself. An invitation to the Davidson Ranch. This could be very advantageous for us, Zachary. Their social circle includes the most influential families in the county. Yes, Father, she agreed, her mind still on Miles's words. I want to hear everything you think. For the first time in years, someone wanted to hear her voice. The days until Saturday crawled by. Zachary endured a walking tour of La Junta with Harold Fleming, who spoke without pause about his achievements while barely registering her presence beside him. She was saved from a second outing when business called him back to Denver earlier than expected, much to her relief and her father's disappointment. A missed opportunity, Theodore lamented. He would have made an excellent match. Zachary bit back the reply that rose to her lips. Harold Fleming had shown no interest in her as a person, only as a silent ornament to accompany his ambitions. Instead, she focused on the upcoming visit to the Davidson Ranch, allowing herself to hope for a few moments of real conversation. Saturday evening arrived at last. Theodore hired a buggy for the occasion, unwilling to arrive at the prestigious ranch in their usual wagon. Zachary wore her best dress, a blue gown that had belonged to her mother, altered to fit her slimmer frame. She had loosened her usual severe hairstyle slightly, allowing a few soft curls to frame her face. You look presentable, her father commented as they set out, which from him was high praise indeed. Remember to be on your best behavior. The Davidsons are important people. Yes, Father, she replied automatically, her stomach fluttering with nervous anticipation. The Davidson Ranch was larger than Zachary had imagined, with a sprawling main house and numerous outbuildings spread across the property. Several buggies and horses were already present when they arrived, indicating they were not the first guests. Miles appeared on the porch as they approached, dressed in clean clothes but still unmistakably a working cowboy. Mr. Williston, Miss Williston, he greeted them, helping Zachary down from the buggy. Welcome to the Circle D. His hand lingered on hers a moment longer than necessary, and Zachary felt her pulse quicken at the contact. Up close, she could see flecks of gold in his brown eyes, warm and inviting. "Thank you for the invitation," Theodore said, looking around appreciatively at the well-maintained property. "Robert and Elizabeth are inside," Miles said, leading them toward the house. "They've been looking forward to meeting you both." The interior of the ranch house was comfortable but elegant, with quality furnishings and signs of prosperity that impressed even Theodore. Robert Davidson was a robust man with the same dark hair as his brother but a more weathered face, while Elizabeth Davidson was a tall, confident woman with intelligent eyes who greeted them warmly. "Miss Williston," Elizabeth exclaimed, taking Zachary's hands in hers. "Miles has told me all about your excellent advice with the peppermint oil. You must tell me what other remedies you know." Zachary glanced nervously at her father, who was already being drawn into conversation with Robert and several other men. "It's all right," Elizabeth said, noticing her hesitation. "The men will talk cattle and politics all evening. Come, let me introduce you to the other ladies." With a reassuring nod from Miles, Zachary allowed herself to be led away. For the next hour, she found herself in the novel situation of being encouraged to speak. Elizabeth Davidson had assembled a remarkable group of women, the local schoolteacher, a widow who ran her late husband's blacksmith shop, and a young woman who worked as a telegraph operator. "Elizabeth believes in women having minds of their own," the schoolteacher, Miss Harper, explained when she noticed Zachary's surprise at the unconventional gathering. "It's refreshing, especially out here." "Absolutely," Elizabeth agreed. "The frontier needs strong women who can think for themselves, not delicate flowers who wilt at the first challenge." Zachary listened, fascinated, as the women discussed everything from local politics to literature. Occasionally, she would glance across the room to where her father stood with the men, but he seemed thoroughly engaged in conversation and paid her no mind. "And what about you, Zachary?" Elizabeth asked finally. "Miles mentioned you have a keen mind for business." Put directly on the spot, Zachary hesitated. Years of conditioning made speaking her thoughts aloud to a group feel dangerous, forbidden. "It's all right," Elizabeth said gently. "This is a safe place for a woman's voice." Zachary took a deep breath. I enjoy mathematics," she admitted quietly. "And inventory management. I've devised a system for our store that reduced our losses significantly last year." Once she began, the words came more easily. She described her inventory system, then her ideas for expanding the store's offerings based on seasonal needs. The other women listened attentively, asking questions and offering their own insights. For the first time in her adult life, Zachary felt heard, valued for her mind rather than her silence. As the evening progressed, dinner was served at long tables set up in the dining room. Zachary found herself seated between Elizabeth and Miles, with her father further down the table, deep in conversation with Robert about cattle prices. "You're glowing," Miles commented quietly as he passed her a plate of roast beef. "It suits you." Zachary blushed. "Your sister-in-law is remarkable," she replied. "I've never met anyone like her." "Elizabeth is one of a kind," Miles agreed. "When Robert first brought her home, our father was scandalized by her outspokenness. Now he consults her on every major decision." "That must be nice," Zachary said wistfully, "to have your thoughts valued." Miles's eyes were serious as they met hers. "They should be valued, Zachary. You deserve to be heard." The intensity of his gaze made her heart race. She looked away, afraid of the emotions he stirred in her. "It's not so simple," she murmured. "Some things are worth fighting for," Miles replied. After dinner, Music began Robert Davidson at the piano, accompanied by one of the ranch hands on fiddle. Couples moved to the cleared area of the large parlor to dance, and Zachary watched with a mixture of envy and delight as Elizabeth pulled her husband from the piano bench for a waltz, another ranch hand taking his place at the keyboard. "Would you care to dance, Miss Williston?" She turned to find Miles standing beside her, hand extended. Across the room, her father was engrossed in conversation with a cattle broker, paying no attention to her. "I shouldn't," she said, though every fiber of her being wanted to accept. "One dance," Miles urged, "before your father notices." It was reckless, foolish even, but Zachary placed her hand in his and allowed him to lead her onto the floor. His arm around her waist was steady and strong as they joined the other dancers, and she followed his lead with surprising ease. "You dance well," he observed, guiding her through a turn. "My mother taught me," she replied, "before she died. We used to practice in the parlor when father was at the store." Miles's expression softened. "Tell me about her." As they danced, Zachary found herself speaking more freely than she had in years, describing her mother's love of music and books, her quiet rebellion in teaching Zachary things Theodore would have forbidden, her dream of one day seeing her daughter educated beyond the confines of La Junta. "She sounds like an extraordinary woman," Miles said. "You're very much like her, I imagine." "I try to be," Zachary admitted, "though sometimes I fear I'll never have her courage." Miles's hand tightened slightly at her waist. "You have more courage than you know, Zachary Williston." The dance ended too soon, and Zachary reluctantly stepped back from Miles's embrace, suddenly aware of how close they had been. She glanced anxiously toward her father, relieved to find him still occupied. "Thank you for the dance," she said formally. Miles bowed slightly. "The pleasure was mine." His voice lowered. "Would you walk with me on the porch? The night air is pleasant, and I believe your father will be engaged with that cattle broker for some time." Common sense told her to refuse, to return to the safety of Elizabeth's circle of women. But the thought of a few moments alone with Miles, away from watchful eyes, was too tempting to resist. "Just for a moment," she agreed. The night was indeed pleasant, the spring air cool but not cold, with a blanket of stars spread across the sky. They stood at the porch railing, far enough from the windows to be private but still within sight of the house. "I'm leaving next week," Miles said after a moment of silence. "Heading north to Wyoming with a herd." Zachary felt a stab of disappointment. "I see. Will you return to La Junta?" "That depends," he replied, turning to face her. "Is there a reason I should?" Her heart pounded in her chest. "Mr. Dawson Miles," he corrected. "My name is Miles." "Miles," she repeated, the intimacy of using his given name sending a shiver through her. "I hardly know you." "You know what matters," he said. "You know I believe in your right to speak, to be heard. You know I see you, Zachary, not the silent woman your father has tried to make you, but the real you underneath. And you know my situation is complicated," she countered. "My father would never allow what?" Miles interrupted gently. "A friendship, a correspondence, something more." Zachary looked away. "Any of it, all of it." Miles stepped closer, not touching her but near enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cool night air. "What do you want, Zachary? Not what your father wants for you, not what society expects. What do you want?" The question struck her like a physical blow. No one had ever asked her that before. What did she want? Freedom. A voice. The right to choose her own path. And this man, with his kind eyes and belief in her worth, stirred feelings she had never dared acknowledge. "I want." She began, then faltered. "I want things I can't have." "Tell me," he urged. "I want to hear everything you think, remember." She met his gaze, finding nothing but sincerity there. "I want to speak without fear," she whispered. I want to use my mind to be valued for more than my silence. I want. She hesitated, then continued, her voice stronger. I want to know you, Miles Dawson, but I don't see how that's possible. Miles's hand found hers on the railing, his fingers warm and calloused from ranch work. There's always a way, Zachary, if you want something badly enough. The sound of the door opening behind them broke the moment. They stepped apart as Elizabeth emerged onto the porch. There you are, she said, smiling knowingly at them. Miles, Robert needs your help with something in the barn. Zachary, would you like to see my garden? Even in the moonlight, you can make out some of the medicinal herbs I've been growing. Zachary nodded gratefully, recognizing the excuse for what it was, a chance to speak privately with Elizabeth. Miles squeezed her hand briefly before letting go. Think about what I said, he murmured, then headed toward the barn, leaving her with his sister-in-law. Elizabeth linked her arm through Zachary's as they strolled toward the garden. My brother-in-law seems quite taken with you, she observed. Zachary blushed. We've barely spoken. Sometimes that's all it takes, Elizabeth replied. Miles is a good man, one of the best I know. And he sees something special in you. It doesn't matter, Zachary said sadly. My father would never approve. Elizabeth stopped walking and turned to face her directly. Zachary, may I speak frankly? At her nod, Elizabeth continued. I was a school teacher in Boston when I met Robert. My family was horrified at the thought of me marrying a rancher and moving west. They threatened to disown me. She smiled slightly at the memory. But I knew what I wanted and I fought for it. I've never regretted my choice. That's different, Zachary protested. You were independent with your own profession. And you could be too, Elizabeth said. The school in La Junta is seeking an assistant teacher. Miss Harper mentioned it earlier. With your education and intelligence, you'd be perfectly suited for it. Zachary stared at her in surprise. A teaching position. But my father would have a harder time objecting to a respectable profession than to a suitor he disapproves of, Elizabeth finished for her. It would be a start, Zachary, a way to establish some independence. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. A job of her own, a voice in the classroom, perhaps even a small salary that could one day fund further independence. I don't know if I'm brave enough, she admitted. Elizabeth squeezed her arm. Courage isn't the absence of fear, it's acting despite it. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small folded paper. Here. This is the address of a friend in Denver who publishes a ladies' journal. If you ever write anything you'd like to share with the world, send it to her under a pen name. That's how I started. Zachary took the paper, tucking it carefully into her sleeve. Thank you, she whispered. Now, Elizabeth said briskly, let me show you this garden before your father comes looking for you. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Zachary caught only brief glimpses of Miles as he moved among the guests, never alone with her again. But each time their eyes met across the room, she felt a connection that transcended words. As the gathering came to a close, Theodore collected his daughter, pleased with the business connections he had made. A productive evening, he declared as they rode back toward town. Robert Davidson may consider our store for supplying some of the ranch's needs. That's wonderful, Father, Zachary replied absently, her mind still on Miles and the teaching position Elizabeth had mentioned. Davidson's wife is a bit forward, Theodore continued with a frown, but I suppose that's to be expected from Easterners. At least she runs a proper household despite her unusual ideas. Zachary said nothing, thinking instead of Elizabeth's confidence and the respect her husband clearly had for her opinions. It was a marriage of equals, something she had never witnessed before. Back at home, Zachary carefully hid Elizabeth's note with her journals, then lay awake for hours, her mind racing with possibilities she had never dared consider before. A teaching position. Independence, Miles Dawson. The following morning, Theodore announced they would not be opening the store as it was Sunday. "And after church," he added, "we're invited to dinner at Mayor Wilson's home." Zachary nodded obediently, though her heart sank at the thought of another formal dinner where she would be expected to sit silently. She dressed for church with less care than usual, her mind still on the previous evening's revelations. At the church, she found herself scanning the pews for Miles, but he was absent. Of course he would be at the ranch, preparing for his departure the following week. The realization that she might never see him again settled heavily in her chest. After the service, as they stood outside greeting neighbors, a commotion near the hitching posts drew everyone's attention. A rider was approaching at speed, and as he drew closer, Zachary recognized one of the Davidson ranch hands. He reined in his horse before the church steps, his expression urgent. "Is Doc Williams here?" he called. "There's been an accident at the Circle D." The town doctor stepped forward from the crowd. "What happened?" "Miles Dawson," the ranch hand replied, and Zachary's heart froze. "Crushed his leg helping move a wagon that tipped. Bad break, bleeding something fierce." "I'll get my bag," the doctor said, already moving toward his office across the street. "I'll come with you," Mayor Wilson offered. "My buggy's faster than your old mare, Doc." As the men hurried away, Zachary turned to her father, barely able to keep her voice steady. "Father, shouldn't we see if there's anything we can do to help, after their kindness last night?" Theodore hesitated, torn between propriety and the potential business advantage of being helpful to the Davidsons. "Perhaps we should," he finally agreed. "It would be the Christian thing to do." The ride to the Davidson ranch was agonizing. Zachary sat rigidly in the buggy, fighting to maintain her composure while fear for Miles threatened to overwhelm her. They had known each other such a short time, how could he have come to matter so much? The ranch was in a state of controlled chaos when they arrived. Ranch hands moved purposefully between buildings, carrying linens and hot water to the main house. Robert Davidson met them at the door, his face drawn with worry. "Williston," he greeted Theodore. "Kind of you to come." "We heard about the accident," Theodore replied. "Is there anything we can do?" "The doctor's with him now," Robert said, running a hand through his hair. "Elizabeth is assisting. It's a bad break. The wagon pinned him against the barn wall when the block slipped." Zachary's knees felt weak at the description, but she forced herself to remain upright. "Perhaps I could help Mrs. Davidson," she suggested quietly. "I have some experience with sickroom duties." Robert looked at her with gratitude. "That would be appreciated, Miss Williston. She's been running herself ragged since it happened." Theodore nodded his approval, and Zachary followed Robert toward the back of the house, where a bedroom had been converted into a temporary sickroom. Outside the door, they could hear the doctor's voice giving instructions, and beneath it, a deeper voice tight with pain. Miles was alive and conscious. The relief nearly buckled Zachary's knees. Robert knocked softly, and Elizabeth opened the door, her apron stained with blood. "Zachary," she said with evident relief. "Thank goodness. Can you help? I need another pair of hands." Before Zachary could respond, Elizabeth had pulled her into the room, closing the door behind her. The scene inside made her heart constrict. Miles lay on the bed, his face ashen with pain, his right leg splinted and bandaged. Dr. Williams was working on cleaning a gash on his forehead. "Zachary." Miles's voice was strained but clear. "What are you doing here?" She moved to his side, ignoring the doctor's surprised look. "We heard about the accident," she said. "I came to help." A ghost of his usual smile touched his lips. "Not exactly how I planned to see you again." "Miss Williston, doctor." Williams interrupted. "If you're going to stay, make yourself useful. Hold his head steady while I stitch this cut." Zachary did as instructed, her hands gentle but firm on either side of Miles's face. His eyes locked with hers, using her gaze as an anchor against the pain as the doctor worked. "Talk to me," he whispered. "Distract me." She hesitated, aware of the doctor listening, then began to speak softly of inconsequential things, the spring flowers beginning to bloom in town, the new books expected at the lending library, the family of birds nesting in the eaves of the general store. Miles focused on her voice, his breathing steadying as she spoke. When the doctor finished the stitches, he stepped back with a satisfied nod. "That should do it," he said. "The leg is set as best I can manage. It'll need time to heal, at least 6 weeks before you can put weight on it, and even then you'll need crutches for a while." 6 weeks, Miles grimaced. "I'm supposed to be heading to Wyoming next week." "Not anymore," Elizabeth said firmly. "You're staying right here until you're healed." The doctor packed up his supplies. "I'll check on you tomorrow, Dawson. Until then, rest, laudanum for the pain if needed, and keep that leg elevated." He turned to Zachary. "You have a calming effect on him, Miss Williston. Good nursing instinct." After the doctor left, Elizabeth touched Zachary's shoulder. "Can you sit with him while I speak with Robert and your father? Miles shouldn't be left alone just yet." Zachary nodded, and Elizabeth slipped from the room, leaving her alone with Miles for the first time since their conversation on the porch. She pulled a chair closer to the bed, unsure what to say now that they had privacy. "This wasn't how I planned to delay my departure," Miles said wryly, his voice weaker than before. "But I can't say I'm entirely sorry to have a reason to stay in La Junta a while longer." "You could have found a less dramatic way," Zachary replied, attempting to match his light tone despite her concern. Miles chuckled, then winced as the movement jarred his leg. "Never been one for subtlety." His expression grew serious. "Have you thought about what we discussed last night?" "I've thought of little else," she admitted. "Elizabeth mentioned a teaching position at the school." Hope flickered in his eyes. "You'd be perfect for it." "My father would never approve." "Perhaps not at first," Miles conceded, "but a teaching position is respectable. It might be a start toward the independence you desire." Zachary looked down at her hands. "Even if I found the courage to pursue that, you'll still be leaving once you're healed." Miles reached out, taking one of her hands in his. "Unless I had a reason to stay." The implication of his words hung in the air between them, too significant to dismiss, too new to fully embrace. "Miles, we barely know each other," she said softly. "I know enough," he replied. "I know you're intelligent, kind, and braver than you give yourself credit for. I know you deserve more than a life of enforced silence." His fingers tightened around hers. "And I know that from the moment I saw you on that street in La Junta, something in me recognized something in you." Zachary's heart raced at his words, at the sincerity in his eyes. "I feel it too," she whispered. "This connection. But my father will be a challenge," Miles finished for her. "I'm not asking you to defy him outright, Zachary, just to consider possibilities you haven't before." The door opened before she could respond, and Elizabeth returned with Theodore following behind her. "Zachary," her father said stiffly, "it's time we returned to town. We're expected at the mayor's for dinner." She rose reluctantly, her hand slipping from Miles's grasp. "Yes, father." "Mr. Williston," Miles said, his voice stronger than it had been moments before. "I want to thank you for allowing your daughter to assist. Her presence has been most helpful." Theodore nodded curtly. "We're pleased to be of service to the Davidson family." "Actually," Elizabeth interjected, "I was hoping Zachary might be able to return tomorrow. The doctor suggested having someone read to Miles to keep him distracted from the pain, and your daughter has such a soothing voice." Zachary held her breath as her father considered the request. After a moment, he nodded slowly. I suppose that would be acceptable as a Christian duty to the sick, for an hour or two in the afternoon when the store is less busy. Wonderful, Elizabeth said with a smile. I'll send a ranch hand to fetch her. As Zachary followed her father from the room, she glanced back at Miles. He was watching her with a mixture of pain and hope that mirrored her own complicated emotions. "Until tomorrow," she murmured. His answering smile carried her through the rest of the day, through the tedious dinner at Mayor Wilson's home, where once again she sat in silence as the men discussed politics and business. For the first time, she found herself actively resentful of her enforced silence, aware of all the thoughts and ideas she was forbidden to express. That night, she wrote in her journal for hours, pouring out her confusion, her hopes, and her fears. The teaching position Elizabeth had mentioned seemed both terrifying and exhilarating. And Miles was a complication she had never anticipated. The following afternoon, true to her word, Elizabeth sent a ranch hand with a buggy to bring Zachary to the Circle D. Theodore, pleased by the connection to the influential family, allowed her to go without protest, reminding her to return before dark. Miles was propped up in bed when she arrived, his color better than the day before though pain still lined his face. His expression brightened visibly when she entered the room. "You came," he said, as if he had half expected her not to. "I promised I would." She settled into the chair beside his bed, removing a book from her bag. "Elizabeth suggested I read to you. What did you bring?" he asked, eyeing the volume curiously. "Emerson's Essays," she replied. "My mother's copy, it's one of my favorites." Miles smiled. "Perfect, but before you begin." He glanced toward the door. "Are we alone?" "Elizabeth is in the kitchen," Zachary said. "She said she would bring tea shortly." "Then I have a few minutes to hear your thoughts," Miles said. "Did you consider the teaching position?" Zachary hesitated, then nodded. "I've thought of little else, but I don't know how to approach my father about it." "Perhaps Elizabeth could help," Miles suggested. "She has influence in the community, and your father seems to respect the Davidson connection, even if he finds her a bit forward." "Perhaps," Zachary agreed. "But even if I secured the position, what then? My father would still control my life, my movements." "One step at a time," Miles said gently. "Independence begins with small acts of courage." She met his gaze. "Is that why you came to La Junta?" "For independence." "Partly," he admitted. "I've worked cattle drives for years, but I've been saving to buy my own small spread. Robert offered me a partnership in a new venture, a smaller ranch about 10 miles from here that he's purchased but doesn't have time to develop." "Your own ranch," Zachary said, imagining it. "That sounds wonderful." "It could be," Miles agreed, his eyes never leaving hers. "But a ranch needs more than just cattle and land to be a home." Before Zachary could respond to the implication in his words, the door opened and Elizabeth entered with a tray of tea and biscuits. "How's our patient?" she asked cheerfully. "Improved now that he has company," Miles replied with a smile for Zachary. Elizabeth set down the tray and poured 3 cups. "I've been thinking, Zachary. The school board is meeting next week to discuss the assistant teaching position. With your education, you'd be a perfect candidate." Zachary glanced nervously at Miles, who nodded encouragingly. I would love to apply," she said hesitantly. "But my father—" "Leave Theodore to me," Elizabeth said confidently. "Robert and I have been discussing it. Your father values the connection to our family, and Robert can be very persuasive when it comes to business opportunities." "What do you mean?" Zachary asked. Elizabeth smiled. "Robert is considering investing in an expansion of your father's store, but only if he can be assured of proper management. He might suggest that your taking the teaching position would free your father to focus on the expansion." Zachary stared at her in amazement. "You would do that for me?" You hardly know me. I know enough, Elizabeth replied, echoing Miles's words from the day before. Besides, Miles speaks very highly of you. She winked at her brother-in-law, who had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. For the next hour, they discussed the teaching position and the subtle campaign to convince Theodore that it would be beneficial for Zachary to accept it. By the time Zachary opened the book of essays to read to Miles, a small spark of hope had kindled in her chest. The following days established a pattern. Each afternoon, Zachary would visit the ranch to read to Miles, staying for an hour or two before returning to town. Under Elizabeth's tutelage, she also began to prepare for the teaching position, reviewing curriculum materials and practicing lessons. Miles's recovery progressed slowly but steadily. A week after the accident, he was able to sit up in a chair by the window for short periods, though his leg remained heavily splinted and painful. During their daily visits, their connection deepened. Zachary found herself speaking more freely with Miles than she ever had with anyone, sharing the thoughts and ideas she had kept locked inside for years. He listened with genuine interest, debating with her on everything from literature to politics, challenging her thinking while respecting her intelligence. "You would have made an excellent lawyer," he teased one afternoon after she had thoroughly dismantled his argument about a passage in the book they were reading. "Perhaps in another life," she replied with a smile. "In this one, I'll settle for teaching children to think for themselves." His expression grew serious. "Have you spoken to your father about the position yet?" Zachary shook her head. "Elizabeth is laying the groundwork. Robert invited him to the ranch yesterday to discuss the store expansion. She says the conversation went well. And how do you feel about it all?" Miles asked. "This is your life we're planning for." The question touched her deeply. No one, not even her mother, had ever been so concerned with her feelings about her own future. "Terrified," she admitted. "Excited, hopeful. I've spent so long being what my father wanted me to be that I'm not entirely sure who I am without his rules." Miles reached for her hand. "I think you're extraordinary, Zachary Williston. And I think you're about to discover just how extraordinary you can be when you're free to use your voice." The warmth of his touch, the sincerity in his eyes made her breath catch. "Miles," she began hesitantly, "when your leg is healed." "When my leg is healed," he said quietly, "I'll still be here, if you want me to be." The moment stretched between them, full of unspoken possibilities. Zachary found herself leaning closer, drawn by something more powerful than fear or propriety. The sound of approaching footsteps in the hallway broke the spell. They separated quickly as Elizabeth appeared in the doorway with Dr. Williams for Miles's weekly examination. "Making good progress," the doctor declared after checking the leg. "Another month at least before you're on crutches, but the bone is knitting well." After he left, Elizabeth turned to Zachary with an excited expression. "The school board is meeting tomorrow afternoon. I've spoken with each member individually, and they're very interested in your application." "So soon?" Zachary's heart raced with a mixture of excitement and fear. "I haven't even discussed it with my father yet. Robert is inviting him to dinner tomorrow evening to discuss the store expansion," Elizabeth explained. "That would be the perfect time to bring up the teaching position after he's already committed to the business partnership." Zachary looked to Miles, who squeezed her hand reassuringly. "You can do this," he said softly. That evening, as she helped her father close the store, Zachary gathered her courage. "Father," she began carefully, "I wanted to speak with you about something important." Theodore looked up from his ledger, his expression wary. "What is it, Mrs.?" "Davidson mentioned that the school is seeking an assistant teacher," she said, her heart pounding. "With my education, she thinks I would be well suited for the position." Her father's frown was immediate. "Absolutely not. A young lady has no business working outside her home before marriage. But father, Zachary persisted, her voice stronger than she had intended, teaching is a respectable profession for a woman, and it would allow me to contribute to our community. Theodore's expression darkened. This is Elizabeth Davidson's influence, isn't it? I should have known better than to allow you to spend so much time at that ranch. No, father, Zachary said, though it wasn't entirely true. I've always enjoyed learning. This would be a chance to share that with children who need education. We will not discuss this further, Theodore declared. Your place is here in the store until a suitable marriage can be arranged. Zachary fell silent, disappointment bitter in her throat. All her plans, all her hopes, dashed by a few words from her father. She had known it wouldn't be easy, but the immediate refusal still stung. We are dining at the Davidson Ranch tomorrow evening, Theodore continued after a moment. Robert wishes to discuss a business opportunity. You will accompany me, and you will not mention this teaching nonsense again. Is that clear? Yes, father, she replied softly, hiding the spark of hope that flickered to life at his words. Tomorrow evening, exactly as Elizabeth had planned, the dinner at the Davidson Ranch the following night was elaborate by frontier standards. Robert had invited not only Theodore and Zachary, but also Mayor Wilson and his wife, along with the president of the local bank and several other prominent citizens. Miles was well enough to join them at the table, seated in a wheeled chair that Robert had constructed to allow him mobility despite his injured leg. When Zachary entered the dining room, his eyes found hers immediately, a silent question in his gaze. She gave a slight shake of her head, and understanding crossed his face. The conversation during dinner centered on business and local politics, with Theodore particularly engaged in Robert's description of the proposed store expansion. Zachary remained silent as expected, though she noticed Elizabeth occasionally directing questions to the other women, ensuring they were included in the discussion. As dessert was being served, Mayor Wilson turned the conversation toward the school. We've had an excellent response to our search for an assistant teacher, he announced. The board met this afternoon and reviewed several applications. Zachary's heart jumped into her throat as she realized what was happening. Elizabeth caught her eye across the table and gave an almost imperceptible nod. In fact, the mayor continued, we've made our selection. Miss Zachary Williston has been offered the position, pending her father's approval, of course. All eyes turned to Theodore, whose fork clattered against his plate in surprise. I beg your pardon, he sputtered. My daughter has not applied for any teaching position. Actually, Mr. Williston, Elizabeth said smoothly, Zachary expressed interest in the position several weeks ago. The board has reviewed her qualifications and found them exemplary. This is the first I've heard of it, Theodore said, his face reddening as he glared at Zachary. Robert Davidson cleared his throat. Theodore, perhaps we could discuss this privately after dinner. I believe there are aspects of this opportunity that would benefit your business plans as well. Trapped between his anger and the potential business advantage, Theodore nodded stiffly. Very well. The remainder of the meal was tense, with Zachary unable to eat another bite as anxiety churned in her stomach. When the ladies retired to the parlor while the men discussed business, Elizabeth squeezed her hand reassuringly. Robert will handle it, she whispered. Your father values the business opportunity too much to refuse outright. In the study, Theodore paced as Robert calmly explained the situation. The store expansion would require more of your time and attention, Robert pointed out. Having Zachary employed elsewhere would actually free you to focus on the business. My daughter's place is in the home, Theodore insisted, or in the family business if necessary. not gallivanting around town as an independent woman. Hardly gallivanting, Mayor Wilson interjected. Teaching is a respectable profession, and the school is just down the street from your store. She would be under the direct supervision of Headmaster Cooper, a man of impeccable moral character. The salary would also contribute to your household, the bank president added pragmatically. With the initial investment needed for the store expansion, an additional income would be advantageous. Theodore's resolve was visibly weakening in the face of these practical arguments. "I still don't like it," he muttered. "A young woman should be preparing for marriage, not pursuing a career." "The two aren't mutually exclusive," Robert said. "My Elizabeth taught school for years before we married. Her intelligence and education were among the qualities I most admired in her." The mention of marriage gave Theodore pause. Zachary has shown little interest in suitable suitors. "Perhaps because she hasn't met the right one," Robert suggested carefully. "A young woman with ambitions of her own often seeks a partner who respects her mind as well as her domestic abilities." Theodore frowned, considering. "I suppose a trial period might be acceptable," he finally conceded. "One term. If it interferes with her duties at home or presents any moral concerns, she will resign immediately." "A reasonable compromise," Robert agreed, hiding his smile of triumph. When the men rejoined the ladies in the parlor, Zachary searched her father's face anxiously. His expression was still stern, but he gave her a slight nod and relief flooded through her. "We will discuss the details at home," he said quietly as they prepared to depart. "There will be conditions." "Yes, father," she replied, her heart soaring despite his obvious disapproval. It was a small step toward the independence she craved. As they said their goodbyes, Miles caught her hand briefly. "Congratulations, Miss Williston," he said formally, aware of Theodore's watchful eye. "The children of La Junta are fortunate indeed." "Thank you, Mr. Dawson," she replied with equal formality, though her eyes conveyed much more. "I hope your recovery continues to progress well." The conditions Theodore imposed were as strict as Zachary had expected. She would walk directly to and from the school with no unauthorized detours. Her earnings would be given to him for safekeeping. Her duties at home and in the store would continue on weekends and evenings. And her visits to the Davidson Ranch would be limited to once a week, supervised, as befitted a young lady's social calls. Despite these restrictions, Zachary felt a newfound sense of purpose as she began her teaching duties the following Monday. The school was a simple one-room building with nearly 30 students ranging in age from 6 to 16. Headmaster Cooper, a kind but firm man in his 50s, welcomed her warmly. "Mrs. Davidson speaks highly of your intellect," he told her. "We're fortunate to have you, Miss Williston." For the first time in her life, Zachary found herself in a position where her voice was not only permitted, but required. Standing before the younger children for their reading lesson, she experienced a moment of panic, years of conditioning making her throat tight with fear. Then she remembered Miles's words, "I want to hear everything you think." Taking a deep breath, she began the lesson, her voice gaining strength with each word. The children responded well to her, especially the youngest ones, who found her gentler approach less intimidating than the headmaster's stern manner. By the end of her first week, Zachary had established herself as a capable teacher with a particular talent for explaining difficult concepts in simple terms. Her weekly visits to the Davidson Ranch became the highlight of each week. Theodore accompanied her the first time, but finding the conversation centered on cattle and ranching. He soon delegated the duty to Mrs. Green, the barkeeper's wife, who was happy to visit with Elizabeth while Zachary read to Miles. As May turned to June, Miles's recovery progressed steadily. He graduated from the wheeled chair to crutches, his frustration with his limited mobility evident though he tried to hide it. "The doctor says I can begin putting weight on it next week," he told Zachary during one of her visits. "Just a little at first, but it's progress." "That's wonderful," she said, genuinely pleased for him though the implications made her heart ache. The better he healed, the sooner he would leave for his new ranch and the uncertain future that awaited them both. "Zachary," Miles said, reaching for her hand as he had taken to doing when they had moments of privacy. "There's something I need to discuss with you." Her pulse quickened at his serious tone. "What is it?" "Robert and I finalized the partnership agreement yesterday," he explained. "The smaller ranch, it's mine now, at least a quarter share to start. I'll be moving there at the end of the month to begin the work." "So soon?" she asked, unable to hide her dismay. "It's time," he replied gently. "I've imposed on Robert and Elizabeth's hospitality long enough." Zachary nodded, trying to mask her disappointment. "I'm happy for you. It's what you've been working toward." Miles studied her face, his expression softening. "It's only 10 miles from town," he said. "An easy ride even with a healing leg." Hope fluttered in her chest. "You'll visit La Junta." "As often as I can," he promised. "But Zachary, I need to know where we stand. These past months getting to know you, hearing your thoughts and dreams, it's meant everything to me." Zachary's heart pounded as she met his gaze. "To me as well," she admitted. "I'm not a wealthy man," Miles continued, his grip on her hand tightening. "The ranch will require years of hard work before it's truly profitable, but it's a start, a future I can offer." He took a deep breath. "If that future is something you might consider sharing." The implication of his words was clear, and Zachary felt her cheeks flush with color. "Miles, are you asking?" "Not officially," he clarified quickly. "Not yet. Your father would never approve without me proving myself first, but I need to know if it's something you want, Zachary." "A life with me on the ranch, a partnership." The word partnership struck her deeply. Not ownership, not dominance, but a shared life. "It's what I want," she whispered. "More than anything, but my father will be a challenge," Miles acknowledged, "but not an insurmountable one. Robert has agreed to help, and your position at the school has already established that you can have some independence." "The school term ends in August," Zachary reminded him. "Father only agreed to 1 term. Then we have until August to prove to him that your teaching is valuable," Miles said. "And to demonstrate that my intentions toward you are honorable and my prospects secure." It seemed an impossible task to change Theodore Williston's deeply held beliefs about a woman's place, and to convince him that a cowboy-turned-rancher was a worthy suitor for his daughter. But looking into Miles's eyes, Zachary found herself believing it might be possible. "Yes," she said firmly. "Whatever comes, we'll face it together." Miles's smile was radiant. "I want to hear everything you think, remember, for the rest of our lives if you'll have me." The weeks that followed were filled with both joy and anxiety. Miles moved to his new ranch at the end of June, his leg healed enough that he could ride and perform light duties, though he still used a cane for longer walks. True to his word, he visited La Junta regularly, establishing himself as a serious businessman in the eyes of the town. Zachary threw herself into her teaching, determined to prove her value to the school and the community. She developed new methods for teaching reading to the youngest children and worked with the older girls on advanced mathematics, subjects typically reserved for boys heading to college. Theodore, seeing the respect his daughter earned in town, gradually relaxed some of his restrictions. He allowed her to walk home from school without supervision, and even permitted her to keep a small portion of her earnings for books and teaching supplies. Miles's courtship was careful and strategic. He made a point of speaking with Theodore directly, man to man, about his ranch and his plans for the future. He attended church services regularly and contributed to town improvement projects, building a reputation as a solid citizen despite his relatively short time in the area. By mid-July, Theodore had grudgingly allowed Miles to call on Zachary formally at their home, though always under his watchful eye. These visits were stilted and uncomfortable, with Zachary forced back into the role of silent daughter while the men discussed business and politics. It was during their precious moments at the Davidson Ranch, now limited to twice-monthly supervised visits, that they could speak freely. Miles shared his progress with the ranch, the cattle he had purchased, the repairs to the small house, the plans for expansion. Zachary told him about her students, her teaching methods, and her hopes for the future. "Elizabeth has been helping me prepare a presentation for the school board," she confided during one such visit, "to demonstrate the value of my continuing as assistant teacher for another term." "That's wonderful," Miles said. "Your father seems more accepting of your position now that he sees how the community respects you for it." "He still believes it's temporary," Zachary said with a sigh. "A phase before I settle into proper womanhood through marriage." "Perhaps we can use that to our advantage," Miles suggested thoughtfully. "If he sees marriage to me as a way to bring you back to a more traditional role, he might be more amenable to the match." Zachary frowned. "But that's not what we want for our life together." "No," Miles agreed. "But what matters is what happens after we're married, not what your father believes will happen." He smiled slightly. Sometimes, Zachary's strategy requires a certain flexibility with expectations. She considered his words. "Deception doesn't come naturally to me." "Not deception," he corrected gently. "Selective emphasis. Your father wants you to be secure and respected in the community. I can provide that security, and you've already earned that respect. We simply need to help him see that our marriage accomplishes his goals as well as ours." The wisdom of this approach became clear in early August, when Theodore announced at dinner that he had invited Miles Dawson to join them the following evening. "I wish to speak with him about his intentions," he told Zachary. "He has been calling regularly for over a month now, and it's time we understood each other clearly." Zachary nearly choked on her tea. "His intentions? He's courting you, is he not?" Theodore asked impatiently. "Unless I've completely misunderstood the situation." "Yes," she admitted, her cheeks flushing. "But I didn't realize you had noticed." Theodore harumphed. "I'm not blind, Zachary. The man looks at you as if you hung the moon. And while I would have preferred someone with a more established position, that lawyer from Denver, for instance, I must admit that Dawson has proven himself industrious and respectable." Hope bloomed in Zachary's chest. "Then you don't object to his courtship?" "I reserve judgment until we've had our discussion," Theodore replied, though his tone lacked its usual sternness. "But Robert Davidson speaks highly of his business acumen, and the bank considers his venture promising." It was more encouraging than Zachary had dared hope. She spent the following day in a state of nervous anticipation, finding it difficult to concentrate on her teaching duties. When evening came, she took special care with her appearance, arranging her hair in a softer style than her usual severe bun. Miles arrived promptly at 7, dressed in his best clothes, his hat in his hands and his expression a mixture of determination and apprehension. He had brought a small gift for Zachary, a book of poetry she had admired during one of their conversations, which Theodore inspected thoroughly before allowing her to accept it. After a somewhat awkward dinner, Theodore invited Miles into his study while Zachary remained in the parlor, anxiously awaiting the outcome of their discussion. She could hear the low murmur of their voices, but couldn't make out the words. Nearly an hour passed before the study door opened and the men emerged. Theodore's expression was solemn but not angry, while Miles looked cautiously optimistic. "Zachary," her father said formally, "Mr. Dawson has asked for my blessing to court you with the intention of marriage. After careful consideration, I have granted it, with certain conditions." She could hardly believe her ears. "Conditions?" Theodore nodded. "Mr. Dawson has agreed to a courtship period of 6 months, during which time he will establish his ranch and prove its viability. You will continue living at home and teaching for 1 more term as we agreed." "And after 6 months?" Zachary asked, her heart racing. "If both parties remain committed, and if Mr. Dawson's enterprise shows promise, I will not object to an engagement," Theodore stated, as if reading from a contract. The marriage would take place the following spring, allowing adequate time for proper preparations. It was more than either of them had dared hope for official permission to court, a timeline for engagement and marriage, and Theodore's blessing, however conditional. "Thank you, Father," Zachary said sincerely. "And thank you, Mr. Dawson, for your patience and understanding." Miles bowed slightly. "The wait will be worth it, Miss Williston." There was one more surprise to come. "I have also agreed," Theodore continued, "that you may visit the Davidson ranch once a week without a chaperone, as Mrs. Davidson has offered to provide riding lessons. Mr. Dawson may join these lessons when his duties permit, under Mrs. Davidson's supervision. Riding lessons, a transparent excuse for them to spend time together in a less restrictive environment, clearly orchestrated by Elizabeth. Zachary made a mental note to thank her friend for her continued support. The following months passed in a blur of activity. Zachary's presentation to the school board was a success, securing her position for another term. Her students continued to thrive under her guidance, with several of the older girls expressing interest in becoming teachers themselves, something that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. Miles divided his time between developing his ranch and courting Zachary, bringing her small gifts and taking her for chaperoned walks through town. Their weekly riding lessons at the Davidson Ranch became precious opportunities to speak freely, sharing their hopes and plans for the future. By Christmas, Miles's ranch was showing signs of prosperity. He had increased his cattle herd, repaired the house and barn, and hired 2 reliable ranch hands to assist with the daily work. Theodore, who had visited the property to assess its progress, returned with grudging admiration for what Miles had accomplished in such a short time. "He works hard," he admitted to Zachary. "I can respect that in a man." The town's Christmas celebration brought another milestone. At the community dance, with Theodore's permission, Miles officially announced their courtship to the gathered townspeople. The news was met with approval and congratulations, especially from those who had witnessed Zachary's transformation from silent shopkeeper's daughter to respected teacher. In February, as the courtship period neared its end, Miles invited both Zachary and Theodore to the ranch for Sunday dinner. The small house had been transformed since Zachary's last visit, with new furniture, curtains at the windows, and a sense of permanence that had been lacking before. After the meal, Miles showed Theodore his ledgers and the plans for spring expansion, while Zachary explored what might soon be her home. The simplicity of the place appealed to her. It was modest but well built, with large windows that flooded the rooms with light and views of the rolling landscape in every direction. Later, as they stood on the porch waiting for Theodore to bring the buggy around, Miles took Zachary's hands in his. "What do you think?" he asked quietly. "Could you be happy here?" Zachary looked around at the land that stretched before them, wild and beautiful in the winter sunlight. "It's perfect," she said sincerely. not because of the house or the land, but because we would build a life here together, a true partnership. Miles smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners in the way she had come to love. A partnership where your voice is valued as much as mine. Exactly, she agreed, squeezing his hands. The 6 months are nearly up, Miles said, his expression growing serious. I plan to speak with your father this week about making our engagement official. Zachary's heart skipped. Do you think he'll agree? I believe so, Miles replied. The ranch is doing well, and he seems to have accepted me as a suitable match, even if I'm not the Denver lawyer he originally envisioned for you. Thank goodness for that, Zachary said with feeling. I can't imagine a life with someone who valued my silence. I want to hear everything you think, remember, Miles said softly. That will never change. True to his word, Miles called on Theodore later that week to discuss their engagement. With the conditions of the courtship met, Theodore gave his formal blessing. That Sunday in church, Miles asked Zachary to be his wife, placing his grandmother's ring on her finger as the congregation looked on with approval. The spring months flew by in a whirlwind of preparations. Zachary divided her time between teaching, helping at the store, and readying herself for married life. Elizabeth Davidson became her closest confidante, offering practical advice about managing a ranch household while maintaining her own interests and identity. The key is partnership, Elizabeth told her. Robert and I each have our strengths and we respect each other's domains, but we also share everything: decisions, responsibilities, dreams. That's what Miles and I want, Zachary said. A true partnership. As the school term drew to a close, Zachary found herself facing bittersweet emotions. She loved teaching and had grown close to her students, especially the young girls who looked up to her as a model of what a woman could be. Headmaster Cooper, recognizing her distress, offered a solution. The school board has approved a new program for the fall, he told her. Weekly advanced sessions for girls who wish to continue their education beyond the basics. We would be honored if you would consider teaching these classes, even after your marriage. The offer was perfect, a way to maintain her connection to teaching without the daily commitment that would compete with her new responsibilities at the ranch. With Theodore's surprising approval, Zachary accepted gratefully. By early June, all was ready for the wedding. The ceremony would be held in the La Junta church, followed by a reception at the Davidson ranch. Guests were expected from as far away as Denver, including, to everyone's surprise, Harold Fleming, the lawyer who had once been Theodore's choice for Zachary. The evening before the wedding, Zachary sat with her father in their parlor, a moment of quiet amidst the preparations. I never thought I would see this day, Theodore said, his voice gruff with emotion. Your mother would have been proud of the woman you've become. Tears pricked at Zachary's eyes. Even though I'm not the silent lady you wanted me to be, Theodore was quiet for a moment. Your mother was never as quiet as she appeared in public, he admitted. In private, she had opinions on everything, some quite contrary to my own. But that was between us, where it belonged. The revelation stunned Zachary. I never knew. She respected the proprieties, Theodore continued, but she taught you to think for yourself, just as she did. I tried to suppress that after she died, fearing it would make you vulnerable in a world that can be cruel to outspoken women. He sighed heavily. Perhaps I was wrong. You were trying to protect me, Zachary said gently. I understand that now. Dawson seems to value your mind, Theodore observed. That's good. A man should respect his wife's intelligence, even if society doesn't always appreciate it. It was as close to an apology as she was likely to get, but it was enough. Zachary leaned over and kissed her father's cheek. Thank you for giving us your blessing, Father. It means everything to me. The wedding day dawned clear and bright. Zachary wore a gown of ivory silk that Elizabeth had helped her design, simple but elegant, with tiny pearls sewn into the bodice. Her hair was arranged in soft curls, adorned with flowers from the Davidson garden. As she waited in the church anteroom with her father, Zachary felt a strange sense of calm. All the doubts and fears of the past year had dissolved, leaving only certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. "Ready?" Theodore asked, offering his arm. "More than ready," she replied with a smile. The ceremony was brief but meaningful, with Reverend Phillips officiating and the church filled with friends and well-wishers. When Miles turned to her, his eyes shining with love as he repeated his vows, Zachary's voice was clear and strong as she promised to be his wife. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Phillips declared. "Mr. Dawson, you may kiss your bride." Miles cupped her face gently in his hands. "I love you, Zachary Dawson," he whispered, "and I will always want to hear everything you think." "I love you too," she replied. "And I promise to always tell you." Their kiss sealed not just their marriage, but the journey they had taken from that first day on the street in La Junta, a journey from silence to voice, from constraint to freedom, from loneliness to partnership. The celebration at the Davidson Ranch lasted well into the evening, with dancing, feasting, and much laughter. Zachary danced with her new husband, with her father, with Robert Davidson, and even briefly with Harold Fleming, who graciously congratulated her on her marriage. "Dawson is a fortunate man," Fleming told her. "Though I confess, I find your outspokenness rather alarming. My practice requires a wife of more traditional sensibilities." Zachary smiled, no longer concerned with pleasing men like Harold Fleming. "Then we've both found what suits us best," she replied diplomatically. As the celebration wound down, Miles led his bride to the waiting buggy that would take them to their ranch, their home. Theodore embraced his daughter one last time. "Be happy," he said simply. "I will be," she promised. The ranch house welcomed them with lamplight glowing in the windows, courtesy of Elizabeth, who had arranged for everything to be ready for their arrival. Inside, flowers adorned the tables, and a light supper waited in the kitchen. But it was the study that brought tears to Zachary's eyes. Miles had converted one wall entirely to bookshelves, filled with volumes both familiar and new. A desk stood beneath the window, with paper, pens, and ink arranged neatly upon it. "For your writing," Miles explained. "Elizabeth mentioned you keep journals. I thought you might want space for that, or for preparing your lessons, or perhaps even for those articles she thinks you should publish someday." It was the most thoughtful gift Zachary could imagine, a room of her own, a space where her voice and thoughts were not just permitted, but encouraged. "It's perfect," she whispered, turning to embrace her husband. "Everything is perfect." In the years that followed, Zachary and Miles built the life they had envisioned together. The ranch prospered under their joint management, with Miles handling the cattle and land, while Zachary managed the accounts and correspondence. Her weekly teaching sessions for the girls of La Junta became a cherished tradition, with several of her students eventually going on to become teachers themselves. Theodore Williston, to everyone's surprise, became an enthusiastic grandfather when Zachary gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl, 18 months after the wedding. He visited the ranch frequently, delighting in the children's development and especially in his granddaughter's precocious verbal abilities. "She talks even more than you did at that age," he told Zachary with a wry smile as they watched 3-year-old Alina explaining something complex to her brother Thomas. "God help us all when she's grown. She'll find her voice valued," Zachary replied, watching her daughter with pride. "Just as I eventually did." Elizabeth's prediction about Zachary's writing also came true. Beginning with articles about education for frontier children, Zachary gradually developed a reputation as a thoughtful writer on women's issues. Her pieces, published under her own name with Miles's wholehearted support, sparked both controversy and admiration throughout Colorado territory. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Miles presented Zachary with a bound collection of her published works. "For the woman whose thoughts I treasure," he had inscribed on the inside cover. "May your voice always be heard." That night, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant hues, Zachary reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From a silent girl forbidden to speak in public to a woman whose words reached across the territory, from a cowboy with a dream to a successful rancher and family man. "What are you thinking?" Miles asked, his arm around her shoulders, his voice as warm and interested as it had been that first day in the general store. Zachary smiled, leaning into his embrace. "I'm thinking how fortunate I am to have found a man who wanted to hear everything I think," she replied. "And how much I love our life together." "As do I," Miles said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Every day, every word, every thought we've shared." The sun sank below the horizon, casting long shadows across their land. But unlike the shadows of her past, these were not filled with silence and constraint. These were the natural rhythms of a life built on respect, equality, and love, a partnership of voices, equally valued, equally heard.